What do you do when life gets tough? You know, those crucibles of life where you'd rather run away, but you know that you have to walk through it. And sometimes it's in our families or in our workplace. Other times it's just in society around us. Well, today's guest talks about the crucibles that he has gone through. Dr. Gayle Beebe joins us. He's a president of Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. And Westmont has literally had wildfires on their campus. They've had landslides come through their neighborhood. And of course, as a college, they had to navigate COVID restrictions in 2020, George Floyd, and all of the effects that that had on our society and on their college campus. And so you're going to love today's episode where we talk about crucibles, but Dr. Gayle Beebe is going to talk about what he learned, some of the leadership skills that he picked up while going through those crucibles. Enjoy today's episode of the Live Faith First podcast. Welcome to the Live Faith First podcast. I'm Elliot Sands, and I'm with Dr. Gayle Beebe. Now, Gayle is a president of Westmont College and the author of several books, including The Crucibles That Shape Us. Dr. Beebe, thank you for being here today.
Elliot, my privilege. Thank you for having me.
Now, as you and I have already discussed a little bit, I did attend Westmont and graduated from Westmont, and so I'm super excited for our conversation today. This is going to be, I think, a lot of fun. Would you give us a cliff notes of your life as we get started here? Where were you born? Where were you raised? Tell us about your upbringing.
Happy to. Yeah, I was born and raised in Eugene, Oregon. I grew up in the Evangelical Friends or Quaker tradition, and it's the branch of Quakers that has pastors, reads the Bible, believes in Jesus, all the big stuff. And then for college, attended George Fox for much of my college. Actually, was a consortium exchange student at Westmont my senior year. Went on to Princeton Theological Seminary for my MDiv, pastored a Friends Church in a bedroom community of Portland for 5 years. Married my wife, Pam. During that time, we moved to Southern California for me to do a dual degree at Claremont, a PhD in philosophy, MBA in strategic management, and that kind of supercharged my opportunities. I was hired at Azusa as a professor, eventually became dean of the School of Theology. 2000, we were chosen to be the presidential couple at Spring Arbor University of Michigan, a sister school of Azusa. We were there for 7 years. During the 10 years we were in Southern Cal, the first time, all three of our kids were born. We have 3 adult children, all of whom are Westmont alums. I'm very proud of that. And then we're in our 18th year at Westmont. And so Pam and I have been married 36 years, or coming up on our 36th anniversary. And our first 2 years were pastoral ministry. The rest has been higher ed. And so it's been a wonderful life, wonderful experiences, and just a lot of variety. Been able to see the work of God in so many places, in so many ways, and really have just loved that and have enjoyed that immensely.
Yeah. Well, that's incredible. And having been in education now as a student, but then as a teacher and dean for, it sounds like, 20 plus, 30 plus, somewhere in that range.
Started in 1992.
Okay. So if I'm doing my math, we're looking at about 32 years at this point. I think that's right.
Into 33. Yeah.
Wow. Would you talk a little bit before we get into your book, which I love the leadership principles you have in there, but before we get into that, would you talk a little bit about the joys and the challenges of leading a college? And I'm particularly thinking, our daughter, we just dropped her off, last August. We're getting ready to drop her off for her sophomore year here in a couple of months. But 18-year-olds, they come in with all kinds of thoughts and opinions, and you kind of think you have the world figured out. And I think the college's goal is to send them out 4 years later better prepared to navigate the world around them. But would you talk a little bit about what that transformation looks like, maybe some of the joys and challenges that you've seen in the last number of years around that?
Well, I mean, on the whole, it's just amazing work. It's a huge privilege to get to do it. And I love it. The ebbs and flows of culture show up every year in the lives of the students. We are a traditional undergrad, National Liberal Arts College, faith based. Our focus is rigorous academics and deep love for God, cultivating both. And 18-year-olds show up really carrying with them the trend lines of society. And so uh, we have been through a tough period in terms of the coinciding with the global pandemic was the huge explosion of the race conversation, not just in the US, but globally, but especially in the US and certainly on college campuses. More recently, we've had uh, college campuses make the news because of the situation in Israel Palestine with Hamas and the Israeli military. Uh, that has not come to our campus as much, in part because we have a Westmont Jerusalem program. And that program deliberately introduces our students to the range of people and perspectives that you have in the Holy Land. And so part of the educational endeavor is actually exposing our students to learning how to live together with difference, that there are many different people, many different cultures, many different societies. And within that are embedded beliefs and outlooks and motivations that we really have to learn and have to pay attention to in order to be global citizens. And so, one of the privileges and just one of the huge opportunities we have at Westmont is really to develop the capacity for our students, not only to serve in every sphere of society, but literally to lead in every sphere of society. And it's something we're deeply committed to. The,
Yeah.
the, it's really interesting. This last year, so your daughter was an incoming first year. You could sense in this class they had had enough time in high school to get socialized, and what you had experienced or what I had experienced in the previous few years was you really saw the effect of the pandemic, the disruption, the isolation, the some of the insecurity that bred in students. And it was refreshing to sense in this last year's incoming class kind of, it's not that you returned to normal, but it felt more normal or closer to normal. And by closer to normal, I mean they came in, they had questions, they had dreams, they had ambitions, they had a long horizon again. And during the pandemic, the horizon just really lessened. And
Okay.
you could just sense that there was not the optimism or the dreaming that you're so accustomed to when you deal or work with 18-year-olds specifically, but more generally undergraduates as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. Both as a parent of an incoming freshman, but you actually took a question right out of my head. I wanted to just what you've kind of seen around that. So it's exciting that to some degree, again, our daughter was a freshman in high school when the pandemic started, and so had a few years to get caught up socially and find trouble. Finding trouble, I think, is part of our growing, and so she was able to find some of that in high school, which caused some challenges in the home, but also a certain amount of like, good, this is the experience you should be having. This is the forming things that
Yeah.
will build you into the person that God created you to be. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to see, I don't know if normal is even a word we can use anymore, but that things have kind of returned back to a little bit what they looked like pre-pandemic. So
Yeah. No, that's so true. There's a lot of good commentary, but also just a sense that we are moving forward again.
yeah. One of the other things before we get into the book that I really appreciated is just the when the difference between students who are living on campus versus students who are isolated in apartments off campus, and just seeing
Yeah.
that juxtaposition from classmates of our daughter who maybe either didn't leave home or lived home but didn't move into
Right.
dorms, and that idea of how important community is, because it wasn't that her freshman year was easy. There were challenges
Right.
and ups and downs
Right.
and all of those things, and she has siblings but basically grew up on her own, so having a roommate and navigating all of those things, right? But what I loved is that she was never isolated, that even if she was going through a challenging time, every time we talked to her, there was a person around. There was a friend, there was
That's
community.
awesome. Yeah.
And it just, in my just humble view looking in, such a big difference on her emotional outlook on life, having other humans around her. And so,
Elliot, I love you amplifying that, because we make a ton of effort to have the curricular and co-curricular work in close partnership with each other. I've worked at 4 institutions, attended several myself, and I've actually never seen it done better. And this is something I inherited, not something I created, but I've just been so blessed by the way in which the academic and the student life divisions are so deliberate in their efforts to work together constructively. And we talk about learning to live together with difference as just a core virtue that we really want to cultivate in every student, because that's the kind of world that we send them into. And it's just such an important commitment and priority. And I'm really delighted that your daughter's experiencing it and truly seeing the benefit of that, and recognizing that our education is incarnational. We really believe people learn best when they're together in community, and we do everything we can to build community in every capacity of the college.
yeah, yeah. Let's transition over to your
Yeah,
book, the Crucibles, and I picked a few of them. I loved all 7 of them, but seeing that we have a limited amount of time, I figured let's just pick a few. I want to start with missed meaning. I do believe this was the first Crucible, and
it
that's just
is.
spawned out of turn because we misperceived the situation.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about this one and why it's so important that we figured this one out.
Well, it starts with my love of Jesus's parables, and particularly Matthew 13, the parable of the sower and the seed. Some will always be hearing but never understanding, always seeing but never perceiving. And for a long time, I have puzzled over, why do 2 people raised almost the same, sometimes in the same family, get exposed to the same realities, end up making different choices about their life with God. And I think it's something that in a small way is really the avenue into the bigger question of, why do some people come to faith and some don't? Or all of us have a need for faith, but why do some activate in a very meaning making way? And then there's some great literary contributions, and I love T.S. Eliot, and I love the 4 quartets, and particularly for this point where he says they had the experience but they missed the meaning. And I think, gosh, that goes to the heart of what we're trying to counteract as an educational institution. We want students to have experiences and capture the meaning. And so that's where this began, was how do you have so many opportunities to really gain a deeper understanding of life, and you either do or you don't, largely because of your perceptual apparatus. When I was at Princeton Seminary as a seminarian, I wrote my master's thesis under Diogenes Allen, and Dr. Allen was a philosophical theologian. He'd been a Rhodes Scholar, a brilliant man, and just a wonderful, wonderful mentor. And he had me reading Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil. And they both, Weil deeply influenced Murdoch, and they both had this sense that the biggest challenge for all people in the spiritual life was overcoming what Murdoch calls our dull, fat, relentless ego. And this idea that your egocentrism can actually block you or keep you from seeing things really just captivated me. And so what I'm trying to do in that first chapter is say, you have experiences, have you captured the meaning, or are these typical blocks, like being egocentric, are they keeping you from actually understanding where you are and what you're experiencing?
That's good. And that goes to one of the things you bring up in that chapter is the idea of self-regulation and
Yeah.
self-understanding, which is what you're getting at. Talk a little bit about the importance of both of those in leadership, self-regulation and self-understanding. They are so intertwined, but discuss that a touch.
Well, thank you for the question. The idea of self-regulation comes from literally my experience in ministry and in academics of just being in situations where people lose it. And by lose it, I mean they end up just going off the rails and committing what I call career limiting moves, where they disrupt people's confidence in them enough that they either have to leave or they're asked to leave. And some of this comes out of my own experience of working with pastors and also professors and just going, what in the world? I never saw that coming. And being in a context with a person who gets so angry, they show a side of their personality that you didn't know existed. And so the self-regulation became so important to me in the 90s as I was trying to understand, why did pastors have problems with anger? And certainly I'd been around, I was a competitive athlete and loved athletics and certainly have intensity myself. But I saw a new level of intensity that was really being done by people that were going to be leading congregations. And it caught me off guard. So I became interested in Daniel Goleman's work. His book, Emotional Intelligence, came out in 96. Working with Emotional Intelligence came out in 98. And it actually began this progression of me developing a curiosity in what would then morph into my interest in neuroscience. And we've actually started a Center for Neuroscience on campus. And the part of that is, what is the capacities within the human to self-regulate? And how do we develop the dispositions? What are the disciplines that develop the disposition so that we can self-regulate? And how is that powerful? And so those are the things that actually were behind my developed interest. I've had this interest nearly 30 years now, and I've just continued to be struck by how people can end up in situations where they commit career limiting moves because they have just never learned to regulate themselves, but also understand how they come off in various situations. I think, like Jesus in the temple, we think, well, if the Lord could be that intense in one spot, we can be intense in any spot. And the fact of the matter is, people often are put off. They may do things to quiet you down in the moment when you lose your temper, but people are put off by people who can't control their temper. And it often causes us to lose opportunities that we otherwise would have captured.
Yeah. Yeah. And I loved your neuroscience stuff. I don't think we're going to nerd out too much on that today, but I was just eating those chapters up because I do find it so interesting how our brains and chemicals and then how stimuli and all affect how we respond and all of that stuff. But I think I've chosen not to dig too deep into that today, unless this is something that you got to talk about. But
no, I wouldn't go anywhere. But it's just a fascinating area.
It is. All right, the next one I'd like to go to. You call it enduring challenge, and this is the keep going, the persevering chapter. Talk about the importance, because this is such a challenging one. You talked about competitive athletics, and I will ask a separate question later, but it seems really simple when you see an athlete just not have their ability anymore, and you're like, hey, I think it's time, it's time to call it a career. But it's not the same way in most career arcs. We usually choose that end, but we have challenges in between that sometimes are like, I really want to quit, but I can't quit, or is it time to quit? And so before we get to the when is it time to quit, talk about the persevering through the challenge. Let's do that side of this question first.
Well, unless you commit a moral failing, I often think people quit too early. And the reason for that is they just get demoralized. And so if we could learn how to endure without compliment, because we know it's the right thing to do and that harm will come to the organization, I think that's actually an important insight. And so chapter 2, the Crucible of Enduring Challenge, really looks at people who have led institutions that they're going to lead for a time. They were there long before they got there. They'll be there long after they're gone. Like colleges, college presidents. I know that for me to be successful, I have got to be a steward of the time that I'm the president of Westmont College. My hope is that Westmont will serve the purposes of God until Christ returns. And so I am really looking at I want this institution to be growing, to be stable, to be vibrant, to be healthy for generations to come. Well, similarly, one of the books that I cite in chapter 2 is Henry Kissinger's book on leadership, where he looks at 6 political leaders who became heads of state, inherited governments or leading countries that they didn't start, and they served for a time, and then they had to turn it over to the next generation of leadership. Well, I think there's some great parallels there between being a college president and being president of an organization or a country that's going to go on, has a long history, and has a long future. And you're responsible for a period of that time. And that's where I think you go through cycles, and you have a cyclical nature both to culture and society as well as just organization. And I like to think about what is the organizational culture and what kind of environmental context is it embedded in? And how do we understand that dynamic interplay between what's going on inside your own organization and how does it interface with the external environment? And you have to be mindful of both dimensions, what's going on for your entity on its own, and then what is the context or the environmental atmosphere in which you're having to work. And so if you're president of a college, you've got to be paying attention to the demographic trends that impact your industry. You also have to be mindful of what are the new areas of knowledge that you actually need to bring inside the curriculum. So, I mean, we're looking very deliberately at artificial intelligence and machine learning. How do we actually bring that into the curriculum at Westmont, not just as a computer science initiative, but literally as a comprehensive cultural education initiative where every student is using some element of AI. Some are using it quite a bit, some just a little, but it's we do not know where it's going. Additionally, as a school like Westmont, we want to raise the ethical questions. What are the ethical questions that AI and machine learning have? What are the ethical implications of robotics? I mean, at one point I was making a presentation I had read an article in the Wall Street Journal about one of the things that robotics will do is displace 37 million garment workers in Southeast Asia. What are the implications of that? That's huge. These garment workers have been brought out of abject poverty because of the global economy. Well, that reality is about to get displaced. And how do we think about that? Just so it's not just a business decision, but it's truly a human impact decision. And those are important ideas to be thinking about.
Yeah. Now, my grandfather had a saying, which I think goes along with what you are, which is it's too soon to quit. That got passed down to me from my dad. He would regularly tell me, son,
I love that.
Yeah, too soon to quit.
Well,
Now,
and Elliot, if I could just throw this in. So, at the opening of that chapter, Cindy Bunch, the acquisitions editor and the senior VP at InterVarsity Press that published the book, she said, I want a list. I want to know, what do you actually think about when you're making these decisions? And she said, do you have something like that? I said, well, I do, but I don't ever share it. And she goes, I want you to share it. So one of them in there is, always outlast the opposition unless it's the right time to leave for the right reason. And I think if you can have a disposition to persevere, you often get through experiences that lesser mortals will choose to opt out on. And what happens is it does harm to the organization. And I have seen so many organizations that thought the right thing to do was, well, there's just too much static in the system. Let's get rid of the CEO. And all it did was it literally started a cycle of decline that led to mediocrity. I think you have to be super careful.
Yeah. I actually call those quotes that you had on that, those were proverbs. I don't know. I don't want to give you Solomon wisdom, but maybe you have it. But
I believe it.
Proverbs. One of the others that I loved, and I won't ask you to comment on this one, but I thought it was hilarious. And avoid no-win arguments. It's like wrestling with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig loves it. That one, that made me smile. I've said it recently, used different words, but I've communicated that. But what I want to ask you about is I've never had an opportunity to expand without a potential problem expanding with it. right? I
Yeah.
mean, we often quit because it's too difficult, or there's too many challenges in it, or
Yep.
I don't. We start looking at the negative and the fears when we think about moving into a new area. Talk a little bit about how we battle that new opportunity versus the new challenges or difficulties that come along with it.
Well, one of the things that we experience if we're responsible for an organization is we have these wonderful opportunities suddenly, quote unquote, fall in our lap. We go, this is going to solve all my problems. I can't believe it. Thanks be to God. And then you actually begin to get inside the solution. The solution is much more complicated than you realize. And what I realized when I came to Westmont, the resource base of the constituency is so much larger than any of the institutions I'd been at previously. And so I just thought, our problems are solved. All we'll do is we'll do fundraising campaigns, and this will just be a life of bliss. Well, what I quickly began to realize is with enhanced resource base come people with just enhanced opinion, and you have to begin to adjust to, okay, there's a different level of expectation, there's a different level of buy-in, there's a different level of commitment. These people are putting in place significant quantities of their resource, and they expect to actually have a significant say in how this plays out, which is different when you have people who are modestly resourced. They take modest ownership of projects and programs. And so that was a learning for me, and an important learning for me. And I just saw it rippling out in virtually every area, that with increased opportunity didn't come instant solutions. It just gave you an opportunity to have a wider reach and influence, but it also required a greater learning, a greater commitment to learning, so that you didn't allow the enhanced static coming back to actually disorient you.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. All
I
right.
do. I've got to throw in. Every morning I read the proverb of the day that corresponds to the number of the day. So this morning I read Proverbs 3. So I don't have Solomonic wisdom, but I totally love reading the Proverbs.
Yes. It's always something amazing how you can read this for years and years, and every day there's something a little bit different in there
I
for you, right?
totally agree. You are in a different life phase, and it's something you've been reading for years suddenly hits you in a new way, and you go, "Oh my goodness, this is just brilliant."
Yeah, yeah, that's helpful. One other thing before we move off of this particular subject, would you talk about the power of gratitude and kind of
Um,
what that does? Maybe we can get a little into neurology, but just what's the power of gratitude as we kind of navigate challenges, difficulties, the world around us?
Well, gosh, thank you for the question, because I became interested in the kind of positive psychology movement uh, during the time that my interest in neuroscience and emotional intelligence was really on an ascendancy. I mean, it had just taken off. It was supercharged by a couple of faculty members here at Westmont that had done their work in one of the facets of positive psychology and essentially emotional intelligence movement. And I just began to, one of them, her name is Dr. Jane Wilson. She would come to meetings, staff forums, faculty forums, and she would always begin by saying, "Okay, before we begin today, I want you to take out either your iPhone and do a memo to yourself, or a piece of paper and pen, and write three things or three people you're grateful for." And she talked about creating a gratitude journal, and she showed the science behind it, the fact that there's clear evidence that when you begin a project with a spirit of gratitude, you actually are more creative, that it develops a greater disposition. You problems don't seem so big to you. You aren't as annoyed as easily. And I mean, just multiple findings of the benefits of gratitude. And then Jane really illustrated for us, and she's now retired, so I don't get to hear nearly as much, but illustrated for us how developing a disposition of gratitude actually just enhances your life and the lives of those you touch. And so that's what actually drew me into it. And I think by nature, I was inclined to believe that anyway. I was by nature positive, and my father, who had a huge influence on me, was very positive, just a super optimistic person. But the benefit for me was I just saw my own disposition. I was kind of a hard edged realist, and I just saw my own disposition soften and really begin to believe the best in people, become more optimistic, and and then I read How God Changes Your Brain. I don't know if you've ever read this book, but
Uh-uh.
it's by Andrew Newberg and an associate. They were teaching at the University of Pennsylvania when they wrote the book. And they start the book, they said, one of us believes in God, the other isn't sure, but we both can tell you that believing God exists is fundamentally good for you. And they start with that premise. And then they go through and they show 12 minutes a day of prayer and meditation can fundamentally rewire your brain. And it can give you a disposition that actually gives you a capacity to handle your circumstances in ways even drug therapy can't mimic. And
Wow.
so I was drawn to it. Now, Dr. Newberg has migrated down to Baylor, but he was at University of Penn for many years in their, I can't remember what it was called. It was like a spirituality center. But the fact that University of Penn was willing to sponsor it, invest in it, really release these guys to do their work was fascinating to me. And so these are all these kind of complementary lines of inquiry that have really influenced me.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and it is interesting. It's always interesting when the world of science, I'm going to say, figures out what God was doing, or kind of some of that thing. So we've had a practice of prayer as a community for thousands
That's
of
right.
years, right? And even when you look at the Psalms, where so often, even in the songs of lament,
Yeah,
you move towards, at some point, towards God's greatness or towards God's goodness, which really is a sign of gratitude, right? Of who God is and
absolutely.
what He's about. And so I love that even if we choose to put a little bit a different term on it than we might say in church, I was talking to
I
somebody
think you're
yesterday and I'm
right.
like, hey, prayer slash meditation slash focused thinking. Like I'm fine with those slashes there because that
Right.
process, that practice, whether or not you believe in, God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit and all of that, that process is still good for you. Like it still brings positive. Obviously, I think with Jesus is the best, but there's still ways that it serves our society, our community, and each of us as individuals.
Oh, I love that. I just find such great benefit in the very activities you describe.
All right, I'm going to move to one that 2020 was a big piece of this, but social conflict. I want to talk about that crucible of social conflict. Clearly, all of us listening went through the George Floyd tragedy slash murder
Oh, yeah.
and the fallout of that in our own communities. In San Jose, we had plenty of marches that turned to riots. In fact, one of the protests was about a house from me, came and the police like moved them, I live one house off the corner. So they moved them, a different direction. But all that to say, whether or not your community had those protests and so on, it was a gut punch, I think, for every person in the nation. And of course, that reverberates around the world. In light of that being a crucible for change, a crucible in the midst of our leadership, what do things like that do for our leadership? And what are some things that you gleaned from that time that helped you be a better leader and helped, improve Westmont and the students that came after that?
Well, gosh, it's a wonderful question, a very difficult question. I think what part of the crucible of social conflict was again kind of reaching back even into some of the earlier crucibles they cover in the book, including the crucible of mismeaning. That I look at the George Floyd murder as my Emmett Till, and all of my life I've heard about the Emmett Till incident, but it happened before I was born, and so you hear it described how it changed how people viewed the civil rights movement and how it began to soften people. It's like, gosh, how could that happen? And when the George Floyd incident happened, I had that response. I was like, how in the world could that happen? How could it happen on national TV? Or not, maybe not national TV, but people literally taping it on their iPhones that got reprinted or rebroadcast on TV. And why didn't somebody stop that? Why didn't the other police officers intervene? I mean, it was just heart sickening. And so I have always had a keen interest, and I believe a commitment, as best I could understand it, to racial issues of racial justice, particularly as they pertain to certain really underserved and neglected communities. And so it was an opportunity to take a moral inventory of where had we as a college community been either lax or indifferent? Whereas we, as a civic community in Santa Barbara, greater Santa Barbara, been lax or indifferent? And where did we really need to redouble our efforts? And so I began to recognize that I had some resources, but I was also lacking resources, and I needed to reach for the right resources. We reached for some. I just read a ton during this time that was all focused on how do I understand this better? And some of the books I found really helpful. Some of them I found really off-putting. And I recognize that I actually believe, like some of the resources I cite in chapter 5, that the solution has to include everybody. It can't, a workable solution or a solution that'll be embraced can't disadvantage a new group for the benefit of another group. And some of what I saw was some effort to do that, to disadvantage a different group, to advantage groups that had been disadvantaged. And you've seen the kind of boomerang negative reaction to that and all of the questioning of the effort. During this time, we started doing work as a college community, and we didn't frame our efforts under the nomenclature that was being spread through the General Society. We framed them as commitment and interest in biblical justice, reconciliation, and diversity. What we believed were biblical values, not just cultural or social science values. And I think that this has given us an opportunity to actually have, as General Society goes through more criticism, I think part of the reason that we're able to actually embed our commitments into our curricular and co-curricular efforts is because they're consistent with our Christian identity, consistent with our Christian teaching, that they really do reflect what we believe arises out of the teachings of Scripture and the teachings of Christ. And so biblical justice, reconciliation, and diversity is going to have an enduring impact generation to generation because of that. And I think it has made us a better college as a result of working through it. Again, there was a lot of tension in society. Also, a lot of that tension came to campus. But I think we also had an opportunity to really address things, to engage in conversations in a constructive way. I think there's ways in which you can host conversations that are effective. I think there are ways that you can host conversations that are ineffective. And by and large, I thought we did an effective job. I mean, you're always criticized, and I'm sure some of the criticism was deserved, but some of it was misplaced. And more than anything, I was really pleased that we actually took concrete steps, and there are concrete steps that will continue because I believe we did address them in a way that was God honoring and biblically based, and that's kind of your enduring anchor by which you need to really anchor your leadership to principles that are enduring.
Yeah. 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 I resonate with that, just that experience of this, just so hard to comprehend that in 2020, a man would be killed on a street the way he was. And
absolutely, exactly.
And I also agree with you that I think the fruit out of that, and we never want tragedy, but we also understand that there's a certain amount of we get better during difficult seasons, and we can either
Yeah,
choose to put our head in the ground and pretend like it didn't happen, or we can look up and go, I don't want that to happen again on my watch.
exactly.
Like while I'm
Exactly.
here, I can start to make a difference. And the Live Faith First, the organization that I work with here, actually, this is what that grew out of as well. Our chairman of the board, it kind of grew out of the George Floyd and bringing people together at a prayer meeting,
Wow.
and then that formed Live Faith First, and then I came on board, about a year and a half after that. But while that was happening to our chairman, God was doing stuff in my heart as well. And so I think that's kind of the pretty amazing thing, is that there were things that were coming together. And I too, as I was a pastor at the time, honestly, I didn't know what to do. I think that was the
Good
challenge.
point.
Like,
Yeah.
well, I didn't feel like I was prepared to really build a plan that would help our church be better at it. I mean, you have a sermon, right? That's great. Like, you have a sermon,
Right.
you say this is bad. I think we can all agree on doing that. But then, like, okay, what concrete steps and
Yeah.
can we take so that our people are better at this, so that we have new thinking in this, so that our attitudes and responses and actions are.
No, no, that's so well said.
Now,
The Elliot, the other thing I'd say is, you've got to start resources long before you need them. And
yes.
I had benefited from growing up in a Quaker context. We were very oriented to Martin Luther King Jr. because he believed in nonviolent civil disobedience, and that the way of Christ, the way of love, didn't allow you to resort to violence, but it did allow you to stand for your moral conscience. And I think that those were important elements for me. Some people tried to discredit, kind of my priorities. They said, I've had these long before we got to this moment. And that's what I think part of your own personal integrity and your integrity as a leader has to be based on things that happened long before you got in the moment in which you find yourself. And so I just continue to encourage pastors and professors and college presidents to, just continue to cultivate your interest in these areas, because we will cycle through other issues, and the same level of integrity that you need now, you'll need then, and be sure you're cultivating it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. One of the things, when I joined Westmont in 1990 as a freshman, 17-year-old freshman in college, Westmont was a very white college. That's what we were in the 90s. That was the ethnicity makeup. It was also good for the guys, but it was 2-to-1 girls to boys. So that was also a good ratio. When I dropped our daughter off this last August, the demographics are they're just a beautiful array of ethnicities on campus, and I was so highly impressed. What are some things Westmont has done to foster togetherness across divides? And often our divides are either socioeconomic or ethnic, but they can be political and denominational. There's so many things. What are things that Westmont's done, or practices that we can put in place that help us foster togetherness across those divides?
Well, again, this goes right back. Some of it I actually cite in chapter 4 and chapter 5 of Crucibles, but you have got to hire people that look like the people you want to recruit. Mm-hmm. And you have to be mindful of your majority culture. You have to be respectful of the majority culture. But you also have to recognize, if we're going to have a diverse student body, we need a diverse faculty, we need a diverse board, we need a diverse administration. I have 5 VPs, 3 women, 2 men. So there's 3 men, 3 women on the executive team. The provost is African American from South Central. The VP of Enrollment Marketing Communication is Puerto Rican. Her parents are immigrants. Edie Schultze just retired as our Student Life VP. She's Canadian. And what you get in that is you actually they have capacities to speak into different groups that just help. And so as we went through deliberate efforts, we recognized we needed to hire people. We needed to create places where students could land. We recognized there are still significant challenges, like uh, professors from underrepresented groups often register concerns that there isn't a stronger culture that they're comfortable in. And so we still have work to do in that because of our relative size. Nevertheless, there's a great deal of appreciation for financial aid programs that help first generation students who are from underrepresented groups, so that it makes the education that otherwise seems unavailable or inaccessible to them, it makes it available to them. Starting first generation clubs that actually give the student coming from their family who's the first one to go to college, they don't have any of these conversation partners that can actually help them make judgments. For example, my son, who's the youngest of our three kids, he would sit down with his two older sisters to go through what he was thinking of taking each semester. They'd go, okay, yeah, take him, don't take her, but not him. Your combinations, and they would literally walk him through, okay, this is going to be a super tough. All of our profs are tough, but some of them are super tough. So don't get two super tough profs the same semester. And those kinds of insights, that is what you get when you come from a family that has multi-generational college attendees. When you're the first one to go to college, you don't have that network. So what we've tried to do is replicate that network internally. And those are both deliberate strategies as well as just kind of human awareness efforts that we have found really beneficial. But it's financial aid, it's hiring people, it's starting support groups within the student population so that they feel cared for, staying really close to them, be super attentive. The intercultural programs luncheon that you attended, that's a very robust program on campus and has been very beneficial to many of our underrepresented students. So there's just, and then you just have to stay engaged. I think we're always tempted to put things on autopilot. Autopilot doesn't work. You've got to wake up every day. When I was doing my MBA with Peter Drucker, he said, a CEO doesn't get to wake up in the morning and go, what do I want to do today? A CEO has to get up in the morning and say, what needs to get done to fundamentally advance the purposes of my organization? Well, I think that's true of all of us. I need to set the tone in that, but I wake up every morning just praying, doing my own disciplines, but also disposing my heart to say, what do I need to get done today to fundamentally advance the purposes of Westmont? And we need to all stay that mindful and that attentive in our work.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I'll just highlight a little bit that one concept of if there's often this perception that college is available to everybody. So, people who don't go to college, it's kind of on them. And though that statement may be true, the idea of nobody in my family has ever gone to college. I don't have anybody to look up to. I don't have anybody to bounce this off of. I don't even maybe have anybody to encourage me to go to school besides, hey, you need to finish high school or whatever that level that your family is determined. And just in this generation, I come from my side of my side of the family. Grandparents went to college and so on, and so there was no option after high school. It was high school and then college. There was no. I mean, I'm sure I could have gone to trade school if I was so inclined, but that was just what you did. Our oldest daughter, we have twins who are 22. One just graduated from San Francisco State, so we're super proud of Athena for doing that, and the other is about a year and a half away at San Jose State. But our grandson's 14, and Annika, our freshman at Westmont, sophomore at Westmont, is already talking to him. He just finished 8th grade, starting freshman year of high school of, okay, Jesse, when you go to college, here's some things to think about. And I just love it because we're creating an environment in our larger family of, there's this expectation that
Yeah.
You don't have 4 more years. You got
Right.
8 or maybe more left. Sorry to say, man, but you're maybe halfway there. And how important that is to cultivate in families. And if you grew up in a family that has that, to realize that not only is it a gift, but those that didn't have it, it is a hindrance to attending college, or it's a challenge to overcome, maybe I should say.
It's a
Uh,
challenge, and the more mindful of that, the more conscientious we can be about that, and then resourcing that so that we provide the programs and the people. It's just such a huge help, and it's honestly, these students who are first gen students are so appreciative of any effort to come alongside them to help them succeed. It's just really rewarding.
yeah. All right. Near the end of the book, you have 7 experiences to help us avoid derailment, and we're all wanting to stay on track. Now, I'm not going to go through all 7, but I would like to talk about the first 2, which is to be open-minded and flexible in thought and action, and develop a curiosity. So tell me a little bit about, sometimes we think open-minded, man, that got to be a bad thing. But how do we stay open-minded and flexible, especially as we get older? It gets easier to get stuck in our ways. And then talk about that curiosity piece.
Well, there's an old line: "Don't mistake being open-minded at one end with being open-minded at both ends, uh, and not having judgment." And what I meant by that is you really have to be open to learning, and this sense that we can reach a point where we can just settle in. I just haven't found that to be the case. And so the two that you've highlighted really, for me, do go closely together. That being open minded and being curious is, I want to learn new things. Now, there are certain things that are fixed points for me, and my faith is one of them. But in that, I think the scripture just gives us so many examples of how people who are deeply anchored in their faith to Christ also had a capacity to love and explore with curiosity different people different from themselves. And I love the story of Peter meeting Cornelius in Acts 10 and 11, where uh, Peter basically says, "Look, I'm not supposed to be associating with you. You're unclean." I mean, it's kind of at some level a very offensive observation. But he goes on to recognize that what God is doing is actually opening his heart and mind to Cornelius and to the Greeks and the Gentiles. Well, I think about, when have I actually been open in that way, where I would say, "God, I'm meeting something that I feel hostile to, or at least indifferent to. And in what way are you actually wanting me to become open, so that I see this person as created in your image and worthy of love and support?" And it's a dispositional effect where we end up kind of softening our tendency to develop hard edges. And it's something that I think even now in this political season we need to be mindful of again, of there are still boundaries based on our Christian convictions past which we should not go. And by that I mean there is no permission to hate. And so when people will tell me, "Oh, I hate that political candidate," I say, "Well, how can you hate? You're a follower of Christ." I mean, I can understand you disagreeing strongly, but and that's where I think we've gotten drawn into some of the cultural conversation that has allowed this hard edge polarization to occur and be perpetrated or perpetuated by social media. And people are just hardening their outlook and their disposition in ways that's really destructive and quite counterproductive. And so I'm hoping people will stay, that I'll continue to be open-minded in the sense of being open to what God is doing without losing my judgment. And then my MBA was done with Peter Drucker. I had 4 classes with him. It was just amazing, and to learn from him, but also just to see him in action. And one of the things that Steve Forbes said about Dr. Drucker in the eulogy that he wrote on Drucker was that he never lost his curiosity. And he literally died a week short of his 96th birthday. And I love that thought that, okay, here is a man in his 90s still curious about what he doesn't know. I pray to God that that's me. I want to stay curious. I want to say there is so much to learn. As much as I've learned, there's so much I don't know. How can I remain curious? How can I remain engaged? How can I continually seek new understanding, new knowledge, and just as a growing edge? And I think that that's a way in which we stay fresh.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, to your comment about polarization, especially around the election season, one of the things we're doing at Live Faith First is we're launching a pretty significant campaign, which is called LRK, which stands for Love, Respect, and Kindness, and it's for
wow, that's
the
great.
whole state, the whole nation. This is an initiative that is undergirded with Christian principles, but just how do we treat one another with love, respect, and kindness in the midst of disagreement? And so the idea is, how do we get people to come in and just think about this differently? Like you say, our goal as Christians, hate is not a word that we should use towards a person. I'm struck so much lately by just, if we truly believe that you and I and every human we see is an image bearer of God, that God loves, that God cares for. When we look at Genesis 1 and 2, and I'm going to get a touch theology on us here, but Genesis 1 and 2 is not a story about Christians or the nation of Israel. It's about God's creation.
Yeah.
And he created all humans in his image, and he loves them. He sees that they are really good, very good, right? And so if that's the case, our hate towards another image bearer of God, we are literally hating somebody that God loves. And if we're trying to emulate God, that shouldn't exist. Now, I'm not saying it's not a process to weed that out of us, but that shouldn't, in a perfect world, exist. And so I'm really excited to see what LRK does and how that kind of plays out across the state and the nation, hopefully. But
that's
also
amazing. No, I love that LRK.
Yeah.
So
see, this podcast is probably going to come out just before that launches. So this is a little precursor to all of that. But anyway, all right. Last question for you. This will just let you go any direction you want. What is exciting you right now? What project, program, Bible verse, person, something in your life? It could be one of your kids or whatever. But is there something when you think about it, you just smile and you get excited and you're encouraged by?
Oh, gosh, I have so many. Just this last week on Thursday, our second daughter got married, and that was a huge thrill. All three of our kids are now married, and we love all three spouses. We're feeling so blessed in that. Huge interest and looking forward to this upcoming academic year. Just a lot of wonderful projects that we have planned. We started some neat programs. But for me, the joy of the job is being with students. And so I always look forward to the opportunity. I host students for lunch in my office. I'll meet them in ways that are comfortable for them. But it's just fascinating to kind of see each new generation of students. And really for students, the cycle for students is about 5 years. And you sense about every 5 years a shift in kind of what the priorities of an 18-year-old are. And I have loved my career because it's had so many fascinating dimensions to it. And one of the most fascinating ones is just these experiences with students that about every 5 years, they just shift and you sense the shift. And, it gives you new challenges as well as just a deeper appreciation. And so many things to be grateful for, and a lot of them are right around the corner as we anticipate a new year.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Dr. Beebe, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And for everybody out there today, let's go live faith first.
Elliot, thank you. Wonderful to be with you.